This morning's sermon was difficult to develop, and I am assuming that it is going to be tough for me to deliver. I want to be up front and let you know that much of the work and process today was developed by and formed within me by Song Mi Susie Park. You may ask, Jeff, who is Song Mi? Well, Song Mi serves as the Associate Professor of Old Testament at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, where she teaches courses on literary approaches to biblical texts and deals with families and issues of gender and sexuality. I leaned into her because this morning is one of those mornings that I am going to be stepping away from the gospel reading and stepping into the Old Testament to preach the sermon. Back in the day, being a prophet was a tough job. Prophets were messengers of God. Here's where it got tough. They were to relay to a community of God's interpretation of their society. Now, I know this might be a shock, but many times this upset those in the community. If we want the hard truth, the prophet's main responsibility was to scold the community about its mistakes. Thus, many times they were bearers of bad news, and this is what made them extremely unpopular. Jeremiah was a very unpopular prophet. Jeremiah lived during a very difficult and terrifying time. His lifespan was during ancient Israel, right before and during the fall of Judah. He was tasked to give news that would be disheartening to the hearers of his words. When we heard from our first reading was his lament. He was giving a raw poem that was sharing negative emotions and feelings. He had sorrow and grief, and they overflowed. In the lament, he complains. Some would say that he complains a lot. He complains that God is only giving him a message of doom and gloom. He then complains that because of his message, he is becoming incredibly unpopular. The unpopularity comes by being ridiculed all day long by the individuals that he was sharing the news with. He then shares a deep concern that he has. He feels that all his friends are sitting by and waiting. They are just waiting for Jeremiah to slip. We can know that this is lament and concern are justifiable by the words that we read in the book of Acts that state that the prophets were regularly persecuted and sometimes killed. So here is the thing. Even though God made him very unpopular, Jeremiah states that he cannot resist God. Jeremiah thought that he could withhold God's message within himself. and not share, but he found out that was impossible for him to do. Why? Holding it in was like a burning fire shut up in his bones. Wow. What a powerful image. So what happened? He must release this pain, and the pain was only released when he prophesied the message that was given to him. For him, running away like Jonah did was not an option, so he recommits himself to God's service. So that's Jeremiah's story. What's your story? What's my story? That is tough. Last week I shared about living out our baptismal vows. I think many individuals struggle with strive for justice and peace. In addition to those vows, at my ordination and into my call of Winds of the Prairie Ministries, I vowed to speak publicly to the world in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed, calling for justice and proclaiming God's love for the world. If an individual is serious about the vows, it could get them in a lot of trouble. When we decide that we are going to stand up and speak and work for transformation in society, more than not, the society is not going to look favorably upon us. This is where I wrestle and fight and maybe waver back and forth at times, just like Jeremiah. So here are two questions that I can and will wrestle with. And I also want to invite you to wrestle with them. Question number one. In what ways have we resisted the task that we are called to? And two, how can we move from a point of lament and resistance to a point of acceptance and willingness? Recently, I was engaged in conversations about ministry. I stated that life would be so much prettier and easier if I always build up, never challenge, and painted a rosy picture for life and what it means to be a Christian. I see many individuals and congregations take the happy talk approach, and I find that unnerving, and if I'm honest, it is hurtful in my opinion. We live in a world that has division in it. We live in a world that is saturated with violence. We reside in a world that seems to have tragedy at every corner. We live in a society where hopelessness abounds. God, in my opinion, has called me to be in the midst of this struggle and call out what is wrong in our society while pointing to God and showing where the presence of God makes a difference. When I examine our world and our scripture, I do not believe that a shallow approach will work. Thus, I choose to dig deeper. And when I dig deeper, usually comfortability is shaken. The first 12 verses of Jeremiah 20 can be tough to digest. The lament is real. However, the lament is turned to praise in verse 13. Hear these words again. Sing to the Lord. Praise to the Lord. For God has delivered the life of the needy from the hands of the evildoers. It's probably been 6 weeks, but that is just a guesstimate because I have lost all sense of time. But I did a fireside chat on lament, and I challenged you to write a lament. A few of you took me up on it, and you wrote out a lament and you sent it to me. Today, you have another opportunity. When we are walking in the midst of pain and disappointment, we need a living example of how we can approach God. Jeremiah, he threw it at God, and God was able to take it. Winds of the Prairie Ministry is not unlike many parishes and congregations in our synod. We are struggling. We are wrestling with hard issues. So here's another question for me and you to think about and to wrestle with. How does a congregation learn to lament together and continue to give thanks and praise to God? Loving God in times of pain can be a challenge. Pick up a newspaper. Click on your internet news source. Flip on any news station, and your despair will most likely rise, and questions will abound about where God is. And how can I love a God that allows life to continue like this? I know that I want to shake my head, but if you look closely, you will see God working. And God is working in individuals like you and even like me. God's steadfast love and care is there for you. So we can lament, but after our lament, we can end with thanksgiving and praise. And let us sing a song of thanksgiving and praise with the song, Our God.